Chapter 14, Major Minerals, Screencast 2. The first mineral that we're going to look at in great detail is going to be sodium. And most of us probably know this already. Getting sodium is not a problem for most North Americans, and our problem is we consume too much sodium. So let's kind of look at an idea as far as where it is coming from. So 65% of our sodium comes from foods that are purchased at a grocery store or a convenience store. Restaurants will make up an additional 14%. This includes fast food restaurants and pizza. Then if we look at other restaurants, approximately 11%, and then other sources account for about 10%. Now, keep in mind that a single teaspoon of sodium provides 2,300 milligrams of sodium. And most of the salt that we consume comes from foods that are processed and foods that we eat in restaurants. Hardly any is coming from sodium that is naturally present in foods. That only accounts for 10%. And then if we look at how much sodium we actually add from cooking and at the table itself, it only accounts for 10 to 15%. If we were to only eat unprocessed foods and did not add any salt, we would be consuming approximately 500 milligrams per day. Now, here we're basically looking at what the AI is. The AI is 1,500 milligrams, and the daily value is actually 2,300 milligrams, and this is generally the number that you do not want to go over. Here, this basically is showing a number of foods that are especially high in sodium. Here we can see dill pickles. Of course, table salt is high because that's all it is. But if we look at other things where we might not think there's a lot of salt, cheddar cheese, milk, there's actually there, chips, of course. But keep in mind, sodium we're going to find in many of the foods that we purchase or buy from vending machines or have been processed in some particular manner. Now, here it basically looks at the amount of sodium that's added in processing. So here we basically have 1 cup of uncooked rice, and there are actually 0 milligrams of salt. If we compare that to 1 cup of rice-a-roni, that has 580 milligrams, and if we talk about fried rice, we're looking at 705. If we look at oil, typically 1 tablespoon of vegetable oil has 0 milligrams. 1 tablespoon of margarine, 134. And then if we look at a tablespoon of a common salad dressing, such as Caesar, we're looking at 160. So we really do get the idea here based on how much sodium there is out there and how much is actually added through the process of processing. Now, if we're looking at recommendations, and once again, these are amounts that you do not want to exceed. So keep in mind the adequate intake for age 20 to 51 is 1,500 milligrams. 51 to 70, we're looking at 1,300 milligrams. 71 and over, we're looking at 1,200. The tolerable upper limit is 2,300. And also note that goes along with the daily value. And also, if we look at what is given through the American Heart Association, and I really like their guidelines, so that would be a good goal. And they are recommending that you do not exceed 1,500 milligrams of sodium per day. Now, when we look at the primary roles of sodium, keep in mind sodium is quite often used to fuel active transport. This is known as sodium-linked transport or secondary active transport, where the passive movement of sodium moving into a cell is fueling a pump to move something, such as glucose or something else, against its gradient. If we look at excitable tissue, sodium is especially required for normal nerve and muscle function. If we think about depolarization of many of our excitable tissues, it is due to the inflow of sodium into the cell. So what we really rely on are the electrical charges that are created by the shift of sodium and potassium as they move across the cell membrane. We have also addressed the role of sodium when it comes to water balance. When sodium levels are high, water will be retained until levels go back down again. If we look at nephrotic syndrome or kidney type disease and congestive heart failure, sodium excretion will be a problem and you will not be eliminating sodium as effectively. Now, if we think about sodium deficiency, this is actually known as hyponatremia. It is rare, but is something that can occur in individuals that perspire excessively. Athletes especially should be consuming sports drinks to make sure that they are replenishing any lost electrolytes, especially sodium. If we look at conditions such as vomiting and diarrhea, especially in infants, it really is important that they are consuming some type of electrolyte drink to counteract the sodium that is lost in vomiting and diarrhea. Now, once again, when we look at hyponatremia, that is sodium depletion, and symptoms are headache, nausea, vomiting, fatigue, muscle cramps, and if this goes untreated, it may start off as seizures, move into a coma, and actually result in death. Now, if we're looking at the excess sodium in upper level, once again, the upper level has been set at 2,300 milligrams per day. The goal here is to minimize the impact of sodium intake on high blood pressure and cardiovascular disease. Fewer than 1/3 actually consume less than this amount of sodium. And if we look at things that are linked to excess sodium, they include high blood pressure, heart disease, and stroke. When we look at someone consuming more than 2 grams per day, that actually leads to more calcium being excreted in the urine. Now, here are basically some choices that you could make in an effort to lower the amount of sodium that you're consuming within your diet. And so keep in mind, natural foods, fruits, vegetables, all of those are actually going to be relatively low in sodium. It's not until you start consuming things that are processed. Examples that are notorious for high amounts of sodium are going to be canned soups, frozen entrees, pizza, lots of fast food items, and those types of things. So keep that in mind when you're trying to cut down sodium. There are numerous healthy choices that you can make. For example, if you are looking at snack items, unsalted crackers, popcorn, pretzels, and breadsticks all are actually good replacements. Seasonings that you could use instead of salt would be fresh and dried herbs, lemon juice, and low sodium seasoning products. So keep that in mind when you are deciding to consume less sodium, that there's lots of options out there for you to follow. Now, the clinical perspective focusing on sodium is high blood pressure. And when we look at the number of individuals that actually are considered to be hypertensive, it works out to about 1 out of 3 adults. When we are looking at what is considered to be optimal blood pressure, we would like the systolic blood pressure to below 120 and the diastolic less than 80. Now, when we look at the type of blood pressure that most people have, it's referred to as essential hypertension. This is something that develops over several years and is due to changes in our arteries, the kidneys, and overall sodium-potassium balance in our diet. Now, when we look at the risk factors that are out there for high blood pressure, they include age, race, obesity, and diabetes. High pressure in the arteries damages them and affects target organs such as the heart, brain, kidney, and eyes. This increases the risk of heart attack, stroke, dementia, kidney disease, and also loss of vision. Now, this is the current classification for blood pressure, and notice what we consider to be normal. Normal blood pressure is when the systolic is less than 120 and the diastolic is less than 80. Prehypertension is now considered to be within the range of a systolic blood pressure of 120 to 139 or a diastolic of 80 to 89, and this is all in millimeters of mercury. Stage 1 hypertension is when the systolic falls 140 to 159 or the diastolic is 90 to 99. Stage 2 hypertension is when systolic blood pressure is equal to or greater than 160 or diastolic is greater than or equal to 100 millimeters of mercury. So these are the current recommendations. There was a period of time when 120 to 139 and 80 to 89 was considered high normal. They have since changed that and refer to it as pre-hypertension. Now, if we look at healthy lifestyles that will help prevent blood pressure, unsurprisingly, weight loss is incredibly effective. I know numerous individuals that have been able to go off their high blood pressure medication just by losing weight. When we look at dietary measures, limiting the amount of sweets we consume, along with sugary drinks and red meat. We want to make sure that we're consuming plenty of fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. It is especially important to participate in moderate to vigorous aerobic physical activity. It's important to make sure that you are not consuming more than 2,300 milligrams per day of sodium. It is important to make sure that you keep your alcohol intake under control. Other things that you might do is increase potassium, calcium, magnesium, and fiber intake. Also, you might want to consume flavanol-containing foods such as dark chocolate and cocoa. Now, here basically are some of the recommendations that should be made with respect to lowering blood pressure and also the expected reduction that you might experience overall. By weight reduction, so maintaining a healthy body weight, a BMI anywhere from 18.5 to 24.9, and that would be kilograms per meter squared, the potential to lose 5 to 20 milligrams of mercury per 10 kilograms of weight loss. If we're looking at following a very successful diet program such as DASH, this is a diet program that emphasizes vegetables, fruits, whole grains, low-fat dairy, poultry, fish, legumes, and basically an overall healthy diet. This has been shown to reduce systolic blood pressure anywhere from 6 to 7 millimeters of mercury. When we engage in moderate to vigorous activity, that could potentially result in a 2 to 5 millimeter decrease. If we are looking at reducing the amount of sodium that we are consuming and getting it down to 1,500 milligrams per day, that will result in 2 to 6 millimeters reduction. And if we're looking at limiting alcohol consumption, and that would be to moderate, 2 drinks per day for men and 1 drink per day for women, that potentially can reduce blood pressure by an additional 2 to 4 millimeters of mercury. So following these lifestyle modifications, it is very possible to significantly reduce and control high blood pressure. Now, as noted previously, the DASH diet is something that is very effective for blood pressure. It is low in saturated fat, total fat, and cholesterol. It is high in fruits, vegetables, and low-fat dairy. So this is especially rich in magnesium, potassium, calcium, and fiber, and you aren't even going to require supplements. And there is lots of evidence indicating that this particular diet regimen significantly lowers blood pressure. Now, if we're looking at some overall nutrient goals, and here we're looking at someone consuming 2,100 calories per day, total fat should account for 27% of total calories, saturated fat is 6%, protein 18%, carbohydrate 55%, cholesterol down to 150 milligrams. Notice sodium is at 2,300, but the goal really is to get down to 1,500 or so. Potassium should be at about 4,700 milligrams per day, calcium at 1,250 milligrams per day, magnesium at 500, and fiber approximately 30 grams. So these are goals that have been established and are guidelines by individuals that plan on following the DASH diet. Now, here basically is a simple eating plan that does follow the DASH diet. And if we look at a number of the food items here, none of this is unappealing. These are typically foods that people would consume on a relatively regular basis. So it is very, very possible to follow this diet overall. Now, there are also a number of drugs that are used to treat high blood pressure. They include diuretics, so they are going to actually include or result in significant water loss. If we look at beta blockers, those are drugs that will actually bind to beta receptors and block the impact of epinephrine and norepinephrine. There are ACE inhibitors, which basically prevent the conversion of angiotensin 1 to the active version of angiotensin 2, which is a very potent vasoconstrictor. There are calcium channel blockers, and there are also a newer class of angiotensin 2 receptor blockers. And these actually block the receptor where angiotensin 2 would normally attach itself to.